Following the Doklam standoff, most Indian discussions on the strength of its military position against China in their disputed ground frontier areas have converged on the view that China holds the conventional and nuclear edge over India. A recent report by Frank O'Donnell and Alexander Bolfras, however, concludes that the pessimistic Indian assessment of the balance of forces may be mistaken and a poor guide for Indian security policy. The report provides a comprehensive open source analysis on the location and capabilities of Indian and Chinese strategic forces and related military units. Based upon this data, the authors of the report recommend that instead of investing in new nuclear weapons platforms, New Delhi should improve the survivability of its existing forces and fill the gaps in global arms control leadership with an initiative on restraint and transparency. Today, we have with us one of the authors of the report, Frank O'Donnell. Frank is a postdoctoral scholar with the Rising Power Alliances project at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, a non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center's South Asia program, and before that, the US Naval War College. Also with us today is Dr. Raji Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow and Head of the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at ORF. Frank, thank you for being here. Raji.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Angad. So should we get Frank? Frank, can we ask you to kind of start off with introductory remarks for about 5-10 minutes so that you can kind of outline some of the major conclusions that you came up with and the kind of evidences that you were able to, because the sources when it comes to subjects such as these are extremely important, but at the same time, they are also most challenging in a sense. So how did you and your co-author deal with those challenges? What are the kind of sources that you had, and what are the major conclusions? I think that would be extremely interesting to a lot of the audience out here, both in India and China, of course, and I think across the United States as well. So over to you, Frank.
Thank you. So the report stems from about 2 years of work, and it came out of just kind of a puzzle that there's a lot of research on certainly Indian and Chinese naval forces combined, but not particularly that much on the Himalayan frontier, and how their ground forces are directly postured against each other, both ground and air, as they would be postured in terms of fighting war against each other. And then also, I picked up on the kind of the question, I think the tendency in a lot of Indian strategic thought to see China as being both conventionally and certainly nuclear terms superior to India, which drives a lot of, I think it's a lot of Indian conventional thought and nuclear posturing. And I wanted to see with my co-author Alex just how much we could assemble from open sources, a good open source orbit of both Chinese and Indian major conventional strike forces, and also nuclear forces as these would be postured against each other, to kind of test what I think is that Indian tendency to see itself as being definitely conventionally and nuclear terms weaker than China, and just to see how things stood. And also to capture how things stood with regard to Chinese positions following the major military reorganization, which I think we forget is the largest in human history. It's larger than anything in the Roman Empire, for example, and how that affected things with China, and that now there is a tripartite military structure facing India. There's the Western Theater Command, and there's a Tibet and Xinjiang military districts. Whereas before there were only two, the Lanzhou and the Chengdu military regions. And so what we eventually came up with, after a lot of research and a lot of time combing and searching and things like that, was that we concluded that India's major conventional strike forces, there's both a slightly larger estimated quantity, but that definitely they're located far closer to the China border areas than China's are. And that if you combine the Western Theater Command and the Tibet military district and the Xinjiang military districts, there is, it's roughly comparable in terms of the conventional forces, but that China's are located much further back. And so in the event of a major contingency, India is operating with a permanent advantage because it has a lot less room to travel to get its forces closer to the border areas than China does. And for China to begin to start moving its forces to the extent that they reach a certain comparable advantage with India, the amount of mobilization and the amount of just kind of dust that will generate will trigger huge intelligence signals to India, which will help it then further accelerate its own force mobilization and even mobilize further forces from the interior. And that kind of weakness that in Chinese posturing, I think, has not really been covered very much in the literature, but that's real based upon the ORBAS that we're able to determine. The second point is with regard to nuclear issues. And using sources that were available to us, both open source and then both some kind of just searching through materials that are publicly available, but we have to kind of protect the identities of the persons who've given them to us, simply certain people who have been careless with their information. Anyway, we were able to determine our best estimate of where Indian nuclear forces are located and within India, and then the ones that are most likely within China to be postured against India. And a lot of the driver in Indian nuclear discourse and debates about China is about the need to be able to hit Beijing and Shanghai with a nuclear weapon. This is the main, for example, rationale for developing the Agni-5. This is the main rationale for the Agni-6, is that we have to have, something that can hit China from further afield than Indian territory. And we found, based upon these materials, that our best assessment, based upon what we have, it's open source, and it's open source. It's our best estimate, is that there is stationed in Assam in India's northeast a contingent of Agni-3 missiles and also Agni-2 missiles. And the Agni-2 missiles can reach most of the Chinese mainland, but the Agni-3 missiles, as based in Assam, can certainly reach Beijing and Shanghai by themselves. And so from that, we came to our policy conclusions that if the objective is to be able to hit Beijing and Shanghai, they can do that with the Agni-3s that are there, and that with sufficient rotation so that they're not permanently there as a sitting duck, and sufficient deception, there's no real need then to go on to develop the Agni-5 or even the SSBN fleet. And that instead, the colossal amounts of money that go toward this should instead be invested in keeping India's conventional forces up to date and modernized, as well as resolving some of the issues with mobility in the border areas that Raju discusses in a lot more detail in her own report. So that's just and in terms of sources, it's mostly, a lot of it is open sources. We saw it as to cross-verify and to corroborate everything that we got as far as was possible. Where there are force locations that are reliant on a single source, we made sure that single source was fairly authoritative, and we marked it out in the report. But we want to estimate that, this is, it's an assessment, and it's our best assessment of what's there based upon the sources that we have.
Thanks, Frank, and I think that was a terrific overview of the issues that you looked at, the rationale for this particular study, and some of the sources that you have. Like I said, these are some of the most difficult issues to deal with, and especially when it comes to open sourcing in countries like India, China are extremely difficult. But I think it's also kind of, I had a few it's a terrific report. It's one of the, I think, the most comprehensive. And in fact, a study of this kind is something that I've been wanting to do for the longest time. So you have beaten us to it. In fact, Abhignan, Reg, and I wanted to do the study. But anyway, so this is a terrific, comprehensive. I don't think anybody has come out with as detailed a study as you have. Couple of questions that I had, and I think as I was going through the report, is of course the massive infrastructure built up that China has been engaged in since the late early 80s, in a sense. That has given China a huge sort of advantage. So even as you say that, China, we may be numerically somewhat equivalent between, if you look at the border forces between China and India, more than anything else, for me, I think the Chinese ability to rapidly deploy forces onto the border, the kind of capabilities that they have built up in terms of the rapid reaction forces deployment, as well as the infrastructure, is something that will go in China's favor. And I think that's something that Doklam, for instance, was one of the few points where India had an advantage. But I think along the border, I think there are very many points where India may not stand in complete advantage. More than that, I would say China is not at a disadvantage, precisely because they will be able to mobilize forces. But that's where I had the precise question about, you say that China, even during a war with India, they will not be able to mobilize forces from Xinjiang and Tibet military districts. Why would you say that? Because you say that it's not very, at least it doesn't come very clear for me.
Yeah.
If it comes to a war with India, they will mobilize forces from elsewhere, including from Xinjiang and Tibet also, I would think. If that can be elaborated, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. We did talk about that in the report, but I think just in a couple of lines, and I'm happy to elaborate. Part of it is that the Western Theater Command, Xinjiang and Tibet they're certainly, the main India-facing military structures. But for example, Xinjiang and Tibet both have a lot of internal stability missions that the Chinese military will be loath to take itself away from. But then also these are the positions also facing Russia. So there is a natural constraint, I think, in the amount of forces that could be brought to bear against India. It wouldn't be, for example, the entirety, of what the numbers and the force locations that are there being shifted down toward India because of those natural constraints based upon it. The same with regard to kind of the Western Theater Command more broadly, as I think that they will be nervous about how much material that they move toward the Indian border, when I think an anxiety that they will have in Chinese strategic planning circles will be that they will want to keep a substantial reserve in place in case of a US contingency at the same time, and that they'll be concerned about that. And thirdly, yes, I mean, they have developed a hugely impressive mobilization infrastructure, which is covered in your report in terms of rail lines, roads. But again, this degree of mobilization is something that can and will be picked up by intelligence. And so that again gives India greater warning time. So there was a good paper that came out, I think last year, by Joshua White, I want to say an India review. And during Doklam, the US offered and gave India ISR updates on what China was moving. And this was the US offering India this. This wasn't solicited by India in the first place. And this was on something on the scale of Doklam, which despite the furor around it was very, very localized. And so it's kind of a combination of those things. It's more Chinese restraint in what it feels like it can safely field against India. And then the additional challenges that I think are kind of inextricable unless there's a major actual permanent force buildup in Tibet and Xinjiang on the Chinese side, is that any mobilization to counter the fact that they sit further back will be noticed by India. Yeah.
Okay. The only thing is, yeah, there aren't too many people who are going to be, too many countries who are going to be, fighting or annexing China. But I think I take your point. Absolutely. Over to you.
I think, Frank, that answers the question I would have posed to you about your conclusions regarding air power. And while I agree that spending on strategic forces, spending on nuclear infrastructure, that money could well be redirected towards building up India's conventional capabilities. And we've written, reams of paper on how Indian air power, in particular, despite being sort of this crucial element of 21st century warfighting, has been so neglected. But I just wanted your take on the same question, really, but on the air power side. What do you make of China's ability to have to deploy more aircraft into the Western Theater Command towards India from other regions? And not just that, but then how does India's capability to do the same stack up? Because what we find here is that we always look at India's declining fighter force fleet as a critical constraint, not in necessarily in deterrence and the first few days of warfighting, but if a conventional exchange goes beyond a few hours or a few localized incidents, then that sort of comprehensive consolidated capability of Indian air power to be sustained in operations over an extended period, that gets called into question. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. India is definitely advancing more generally in fielding and developing its fifth generation aircraft, the J-10s, the J-11s. But they do have, again, constraints that India doesn't. So for example, we talk about this in the report, but that due to the really terrible climatic conditions and also due to the altitude of the Tibet and Xinjiang airfields, their planes on average have to take off with about half of their possible payload and fuel load. And that's kind of a constraint that China has that India doesn't. On the Indian side, one thing that I think China is getting anxious about is the amount of diversification of bases that India is appropriately working on. So building out a huge number of advanced landing grounds as well as airfields, so that in order to build out enough redundancy, so that if China tries to hit a few airfields, that it can't hit them all. I'll keep my answer brief to that.
Thanks, Frank. And on the subject of ballistic missile submarines and the investment in that direction, and that you believe that your report says would be better directed towards conventional force structures. There's a view in India, certainly in the popular view, that submarine-launched ballistic missiles are sort of the most credible form of second strike, and therefore fit with a robust and credible no first use posture. So taking money away from a credible, survivable submarine leg of the nuclear triad isn't something that most people would find palatable over here. So how would you sort of support that suggestion that the money should be taken away from the SLBM?
Yeah, no, I understand that won't be a popular view in India. And what I would say is that India is like China in many ways, in terms of it has a gigantic geography. And we have to bear in mind that China has, for decades, managed to survive and have a credible nuclear force without having an SSBM force. And it survived by having a road mobile, very long range, ground-based missile force. And we argue in the report that India should work on developing the kind of road and rail links and kinds of deception infrastructure, bunkers, and so on, to focus on having that road mobile, rail mobile Agni 3, Agni 2 force, and that with sufficient rotation and taking huge advantage of India's gigantic geography, that this is enough to generate credibility. This is the same view that China has had, for example, with its own nuclear force.
Mike, finally, just one quick point is that we are talking essentially about the peacetime deployment. When it comes to wartime scenarios, China's ability to mobilize forces is that much quicker, and they are also able to sustain those forces on the border areas and Tibet areas because of the number of logistic depots, oil depots, and all of that, those things that have come up.
Mm.
Whereas even for India to mobilize on it during a wartime condition, I think that's going to be a lot more challenging. Any thoughts on that? I think that would be really nice to sum up in a sense.
Yeah, that's certainly a good issue to talk about. I think it's something that I'd have to look at in the update to the report, the amount of logistics and material and just average the oil and so on that's available to both India and China.
Yep.
But I think I have to get back to my point is that the kind of activity that China would demonstrate in terms of getting ready for something bigger than what they have right now would certainly be noticed by the U.S. and then India, and then trigger. It's kind of the same dynamic that comes in place, and I think the real challenge for us to keep an eye on is whether India compensates for this overall by moving either kind of permanent rotation of major forces into and out of Tibet to a level equivalent to that India has in our report, so that it becomes kind of normal in a way. And so India can't really tell when China is preparing for a major strike or not, because they're constantly moving forces in and out, or a permanent fixture of having them permanently there, which would deal with the acclimatization issue, which you talk about in your report, but we probably don't have time to talk about today. And that absent those two things happening, which I don't think have happened yet, I think that basic challenge for China is going to remain.
And I think what China has been doing, at least in the last few years, is to try and address one of the biggest lacunae on the part of the PLA, which is the lack of operational experience, war experience in a sense. And that's precisely why they have been doing, in fact, PLA Air Force joint exercises in an intensified and focused manner, including wartime like conditions are being simulated and so on and so forth in Tibet and border areas. So that's something that they recognize and their weaknesses, and they are able to kind of start addressing them. The efficiency and the efficacy of those exercises, I think it's very difficult to ascertain for us, any of us sitting here, and that you can tell only when there is actually an operation in a sense. But I think they are clearly trying to address that particular gap in their on their overall military power, capacity, capabilities, and that itself is worth watching from all the important partners, Indo-Pacific partners, I would think.
Frank, Raji, thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for today. Links to the report and the policy recommendations based on that report by Frank O'Donnell and Alexander Bolfras will be available in the description to this video, along with links to work done by ORF on the subject of India and China's strategic posture. Frank, thank you for being with us. Raji, same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ankit.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Frank. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you guys.